Saving Walt by Andrew L. Young. Read by Owen McEwen. Chapter 1. The Ritual. It was 1965, and Disneyland was truly the happiest place on earth. But as songwriter Richard Sherman entered the gates of the world's greatest theme park, he was anything but euphoric. He watched as eager children beamed with excitement. Many of them jumped up and down and practically dragged their poor parents through the theme park gates, undoubtedly getting ready to route march them through the various lands like a military sergeant would a cadet in boot camp. But unlike everyone else, Richard was melancholy. He had received the call that morning, and he had promptly left the Walt Disney Studios in Burbank and drove nearly an hour south down to Anaheim. His head hung down, and he looked at his feet as he proceeded down Main Street, USA, Walt Disney's replica of 1900 idyllic small-town life. He was so accustomed to making this trip that he knew the way to the fire station instinctively. His pace wasn't slow, but each step felt heavy. He felt the collision before he fully realized what had happened. "Hey, buddy, watch where you're going!" Richard looked up and saw that he had accidentally collided with a guest. He mumbled an apology and nervously walked away. But as he sought to escape the awkward encounter, he heard a song coming from the town square. It was his song. He stopped and turned around, and in the middle of the square stood Mary Poppins herself, looking angelic in the pristine white dress with red lace that she wore in the film. She was singing Sherman's song to a crowd of enchanted onlookers. Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious delighted millions, and he couldn't have been more proud of it. So he allowed himself a moment to appreciate his achievement. The song was his creation, his and his brother's, and although the woman singing in the town square of Disneyland was no Julie Andrews, she nevertheless was hitting the right notes. Walt always made sure that the actresses were amazing. That's why Disneyland employees were called cast members and not, well, employees. Everything about Disneyland was designed to bring the guests into another world. People came here to experience the movies, not just watch them. As Mary Poppins concluded his song, Richard looked up and around. For the first time in years, he marveled at Disneyland. The songs from Mary Poppins were indeed his creation, but it was only a small part of Walt's world. Richard Sherman loved his boss and the opportunities working for Walt had afforded him. He just wished Walt didn't always request that song. Walt never wanted to hear Jolly Holiday or I Love to Laugh. Always, it was the song about the beggar woman who sat at the foot of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, England. He would never say it out loud, but at times Richard had secretly wished he had never written that song. But at the time he and his brother were composing it, there was no way they could have foreseen what was to come. It wasn't meant to be sad, only a moment of reflection to help rich children appreciate the fact that not everyone lived like they did, and to help a wayward, career-oriented father appreciate his children in a way he hadn't done before. He had made the comparison in his head 100 times. He had initially assumed that Walt identified with the distant father, Mr. Banks. But Walt Disney was no George Banks. Walt loved his daughters, and they loved him. Practically every child on the planet adored Walt Disney. It might be better to ask, what child doesn't love Mickey Mouse and Disneyland? Heck, even the leader of the Soviet Union loved Disneyland. So, why would Walt feel depressed about achieving something so spectacular? He had accomplished more in the past 20 years than 100 men could ever hope to do in a lifetime. It just didn't make any sense. Richard entered the nondescript door on the ground floor of the fire station. He walked past Walt's secretary. The two always exchanged an awkward glance but never spoke. She didn't announce his arrival because she didn't have to. Richard climbed up the stairs to Walt's secret office, the office he had built for himself so that he could look out onto Main Street, USA, and admire the manifestation of his vision. This was the 37th time he had entered Walt's inner sanctum, and this time seemed no different from the 36th. He had long since stopped noticing the intricate details of the office, which was furnished more like a small apartment than a place to do business. It was a perfect blend of Victorian England mixed with turn-of-the-century American West. Davy Crockett meets Mary Poppins. From the roses embroidered on the carpets to the small clocks, vases, lamps, and teacups adorning the windowsills. There was even an old-style phonograph record player. Richard wondered if Walt actually did any real business here. He had a massive office in the studios at Burbank. It was rumored that Walt would occasionally host dignitaries in his small apartment. But more often than dignitaries, Walt hosted his grandchildren, who would get to spend the night in Disneyland. Richard thought that must be absolute heaven on earth for a small child. Walt was a brilliant storyteller, so no doubt Walt regaled his grandchildren with fun stories and silly anecdotes. Richard wondered what the apartment sounded like when it was full of laughter. But he knew he would hear no such joyful noises here today. He saw Walt standing at the edge of the apartment. He didn't turn to greet Richard. Rather, he just stared out the window, lost in thought. Other than the occasional smoker's cough, he didn't utter a sound. In the beginning, Walt had given Richard specific instructions to play the song. And Richard did as he was told. But by this point, Walt didn't need to say a thing. Walt just poured himself a glass of brandy and stared out at the families coming and going from his theme park. Richard sat down at the piano. But next to Walt, he noticed something new. It was an easel or some sort of blackboard. It almost looked like a ghost because it was draped in a white sheet. What could that be? Richard thought to himself. Probably just a new attraction, he concluded. But he dismissed his curious thoughts. It was time to begin. He opened the key lid to the piano. He stretched his fingers and placed them accordingly. Then he waited. Richard always waited until he saw Walt take a sip of his drink, which Richard took as a tacit signal to begin. And as the glass touched Walt's lips, Richard's fingers began dancing upon the keys, and all his theories and machinations melted away with his song. Early each day to the steps of St. Paul's, the little old bird woman comes. Richard tried to evoke emotion, but he was always careful about not overdoing it. But inevitably, when he came to the chorus and sang the 3 words, "Feed the birds," tears would stream down Walt Disney's face. The first time he had seen Walt Disney cry at his song, he became worried and immediately stopped. But Walt told him sternly to keep going. Richard had tried to protest, but Walt had insisted. But now, he felt guilty for even glancing in Walt's direction. He felt guilty for causing Walt to feel sadness, but he felt more guilty for stealing the occasional glance. He knew better than to gawk, but at times he couldn't help himself. Usually he forced himself to look down at the ebony and ivory keys. Richard wanted to be respectful of Walt and his ritual, even if it was rather grim. Whatever was going on inside Walt's soul, this was his time. This was his private moment. He had certainly earned it. A time where Walt Disney could stop being America's favorite uncle and just let his feelings flow out like a river. Though her words are simple and few, listen, listen, she's calling to you. Walt continued to weep. Richard could see Walt's shoulders shaking with emotion out of the corner of his eye. He stole another glance, but immediately felt guilty again. He forced himself to look at the keys and focus on the words. Just a few more words, and the ritual would all be over, at least for another week or 2. Tuppence, tuppence, tuppence a bag. And after he finished the song, he stood up without saying a word. Instantly, the theories immediately began racing through his mind again. Did Walt identify with the peddler woman who wanted to look after the lowliest of creatures? Did the song somehow make him feel humble or lowly? He had already analyzed the Mr. Banks theories to death, so he dismissed those. Perhaps Walt was only deeply moved by that song. Richard would never even dream of asking Walt directly. He had vowed to do it on the second time Walt had asked him to come and play the song, but after watching Walt cry, he couldn't muster the nerve. And now it had happened too many times. Walt didn't thank Richard or even look in his general direction. But Richard didn't need the acknowledgement. He was happy to make a hasty exit and return to the studios where he could get back to writing songs, happy songs, songs about singing, dancing cartoon animals. Only Walt's coughing broke the silence as Richard moved towards the apartment door. Walt had been a chain smoker all his life, and so he had always had a bit of a cough. But this one sounded worse. It was far deeper and more guttural than Richard had become accustomed to hearing. Richard was concerned for his boss, but Richard assured himself that no doubt Walt's wife Lillian and his daughters had probably all tried to warn him to lay off the cigarettes. And if Walt hadn't listened to them, he wasn't about to listen to a mere employee. Who was he to tell Walt Disney anything? Richard thought to himself. And this time, as he descended the stairs down from Walt's apartment, he felt unworthy. Unworthy for sharing such a deeply intimate moment with a man he had only known a few years. Unworthy of seeing the raw emotions of one of the world's most creative geniuses. Unworthy for being unable to provide any real solace to a man who was clearly in pain. A wave of guilt rushed over Richard. Guilt and confusion. Why me? Why not a pastor or a priest? Or his wife or his daughters? Surely one of them could play the piano. But the answers never came. And as he passed Walt's secretary, he paused for a moment. He looked her in the eyes. He opened his mouth to ask a question, secretly hoping that she might be able to give him a clue as to why Walt Disney wanted to hear "Feed the Birds" so frequently. But Richard could see in her eyes that she was just as clueless as he. She probably wanted to ask him the same question, but, like him, she would never dare. He closed his mouth, gave her an awkward nod, and walked out into the happy crowds of Main Street, USA. Chapter 2. The Vulture of Philadelphia. It was a warm summer's afternoon in 1965, and in downtown Philadelphia, at the top of one of the city's tallest skyscrapers, two men sat alone in a corporate boardroom, concluding what had been a long and bitter battle for one of the first hostile takeovers in America. "It's more than fair," said Sol Barish, pushing the final papers in front of Dean Foster, the outgoing president of LEF Insurance. LEF stood for Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. Liberty, equality, and fraternity. But the stout yet ambitious young Barish had demonstrated no such qualities in recent months as he sought to acquire the large Philadelphia-based insurance company by any means necessary. "Is this payback for not hiring you?" asked Foster, giving the incoming president a withering glare. "Come on, Dean, it's nothing personal." "What do you know about the insurance business?" "Enough to know that your stock price was trading well below the asset value." "Half the city went up in flames. We just needed more time." "You should have chosen better clients." Barish feared that his quips might be bordering on schoolyard taunts. Yes, Foster had passed over him when he applied for a job 5 years ago, after he had graduated from the Wharton School of Business. But this wasn't personal. It was just business. Barish knew that he needed to get Foster to sign the papers, and ridiculing the old man for bad business decisions wasn't going to help. The company's board had agreed to sell Barish LEF, but Foster could still sue him personally. And that would be months of expensive, protracted litigation with inevitably bad headlines, which might cause the board to reconsider. Barish tried to force himself to smile in a bad attempt to look at Foster reassuringly. But his fake smile was only met again with a glare. Barish didn't blame Foster for hating him. LEF Insurance was primarily a locally based insurance company, selling to clients based in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. The race riots of the previous year had hit all the company's largest clients at once. The stock price tanked, and before Foster knew what was happening, Barish had already owned a 20% stake in the company. Barish leveraged, borrowed, mortgaged, and sold everything he had to continue buying the company's stock, and in the end, he made the LEF board a deal they couldn't refuse, even over Foster's vociferous objections.
My great-grandfather founded this company. It's my family's company. I can't sign it away. I won't.
Foster pushed the papers away in defiance. If it makes you feel any better, I'm going to make LEF much greater than any one insurance company. I promise you that.
What are you going to do?
We're going to invest in companies and make them bigger and better.
And what about the ones that are going through a rough patch?
Come on, Dean. I can't promise I won't look for good buying opportunities.
What you did was a dirty trick.
Maybe, but it was not illegal. At least, that's what Barish told himself, but he knew to keep that thought to himself. Foster wasn't the only person who attacked Barish's business practices. All the financial journalists from Philly to New York were calling him a vulture for capitalizing on the financial distress in the wake of a series of race riots. They called him a vulture, picking away at the carnage in the city of brotherly love. But Barish didn't care about labels. He was 6 months shy of his 30th birthday, and he was on the cusp of becoming a multi-millionaire. All he needed was Foster to sign over the final documents, and it would all be his. Barish pushed the papers in front of Foster. It's time, Dean. There's nothing left to discuss.
All you people care about is money.
A wave of anger came over Barish. It wasn't like this was the first time he had been taunted like that. Growing up in New York City, he had become accustomed to much worse. But he had beaten Foster fair and square. His own board had approved the deal. Barish quickly concluded that being kind was wasted on Foster, so it was time to play hardball. How many of your relatives still work here, Dean? At least a dozen? Not to mention close friends? How I deal with them is entirely up to you. So I suggest you apologize and sign the papers. Barish didn't need to say, or else, but the implication was clear. Barish pushed the papers back in front of Foster and placed a pen firmly on top of the stack. He met Foster's glare with a stern look, and the two titans of industry stared at each other, now with mutual contempt. Barish didn't get the apology, but he got Foster's signature. And just like that, it was done. Sol Barish had graduated with an MBA just 5 years ago. At the time, no one had wanted to hire him, including LEF. And now he was in control of a corporation that had an annual revenue stream of $15 million. In truth, Barish didn't care about the insurance industry. But he knew business. He knew good investments when he saw them. And he had just proved to the world he could even take a large corporation by force. Let them call me a vulture, he thought to himself. Better to be an infamous vulture than a nameless mid-level paper pusher in someone else's company. Barish had put the business world on notice. He was now a titan of the finance industry, and everyone knew it. And for that, he definitely felt pride. Before the day was over, Barish was directing a team of construction workers in his new office. He was having them demolish the wall between the offices of the former president and vice president, so Barish would have a massive office with a wide and truly spectacular view of Philadelphia. Barish resolved to have them repaint the walls from a drab brown to a more modern and brighter yellow, along with importing new modern furniture from Europe.
Daddy, Daddy!
Barish heard a familiar voice, and he turned around and saw his 4-year-old daughter Sarah running towards him, his wife Rebecca following behind. Barish snatched his daughter up and swung her around. She squealed with delight. "I just wanted to show Sarah your new office," said Rebecca. "Daddy, will you read me a story?" "Sure thing, sweetie, as soon as I get home tonight." "Why not now?" "Because Daddy's working, sweetheart," said his wife. Barish noticed that his daughter was carrying a ragged and torn Mickey Mouse plush doll. She had had it her whole life, and he knew that she was very attached to it. But it looked as if it might literally fall to pieces. "Sarah, now that Daddy's deal was successful, we can get you a new Mickey Mouse." The child gave her father a frown and clutched the doll for dear life. She instantly began squirming to get away from her father to protect Mickey. Barish put his daughter down, and she promptly ran back to her mother. "Sweetheart, you can have whatever you want." "Can I have 2 desserts tonight?" "Not on your life, Missy. I don't want your teeth rotting." "I've got a better idea. Why don't we all go to Disneyland?" Sarah's eyes went wide, and she began jumping for joy. Barish watched the child's excitement, and he just knew that ragged Mickey Mouse doll was going to rip apart in the process. And yet, miraculously, it did not. The whole thing confounded Barish, but he nevertheless resolved to get his daughter a new doll in California. "There will be so many other Mickey Mouse dolls, she'll forget about that old one. And then I could finally pitch it." A month later, Barish had been true to his word. He, his wife, and their ecstatic daughter stood at the entrance to Disneyland. But Barish felt more confused than anything else. "So let me get this straight. It costs me and my wife $1.60 just to get into the park, but I have to buy a separate ticket for each attraction?" The acne-covered teenager on the other side of the ticket booth nodded in agreement. "But each book of tickets is $3.45. "Daddy, I want to see Mickey Mouse." His daughter anxiously tugged at his hand, desperate to get him to the park. "Yes, Pumpkin, we will." But Barish's confusion was turning into annoyance. "But I can't use these tickets for the same ride, can I? Like, we can't ride Dumbo 10 times? "But Daddy, I want to ride Dumbo." "Yes, Sarah, we will." "But you just said we can't." The teenager explained that every attraction at Disneyland corresponded with a letter, A, B, C, D, and E. And this is where Barish found that his MBA in finance completely failed him. But the map doesn't tell us which rides are which letters." Barish held up the map of Disneyland to the ticket booth attendant, who just smiled and repeated his less-than-thorough explanation of ticket classifications. "So what if I want to buy a book of just 10 E tickets?" Barish grit his teeth as the teenager explained that this was not possible. Well, not at the gate, anyway. Individual tickets could be purchased inside the park. But the big book of 10 tickets was much better value, the teenager explained. Barish was a giant in the world of finance, but he couldn't deduce whether it was better to buy several books of tickets at the gate or take his chances and buy individual tickets later inside the park. He looked down at the map, trying to deduce which rides were most likely to correspond to particular letters. But he was clueless. His wife gave him a look. She was becoming annoyed as well. He knew he could afford 100 books of tickets, and he had no qualms about spoiling his child on her first trip to Disneyland. But it was the principle of the thing. He was a financial expert, and he was determined to figure out how his family could get the maximum value at the cheapest price. "Honey, Sarah's getting antsy." With his child growing upset and his wife's patience waning, he gave in. "Just give me 3 ticket books each." Sol Barish wasn't sure if the ticketing structure of Disneyland was insidiously genius or just designed in an incompetent manner. He vowed to do the calculations later that night so he could be sure to get the best value when the family returned to the park tomorrow. The teenager calculated the prices, and the grand total for all 3 of them was $39.80. Definitely insidious, Barish thought to himself. He pulled out his wallet and opened it up, and he pulled out $40. What are the jumbo books of 15? Barish looked up and around. His wife was pointing to another sign behind the pimply-faced teenager. Barish didn't know how he had missed it. There was a smaller sign that said, Adventure Book Jumbo 15. Barish looked down and saw that a book of 15 tickets was only $1 more than the book of 10. Now he was furious. This seemingly stupid teenager was trying to get one over on him. Him! He opened his mouth to curse the boy out. Then he had a better thought to call the boy's manager. It was his job to inform customers of the best ticket options, and this acne-ridden brat wasn't about to pull the wool over his eyes. "Honey," his wife said, and she picked up Sarah, who was smiling with anticipation and clearly oblivious to the drama that was preventing her from entering Disneyland. Sol's quest for justice over the ticket book fiasco would have to wait. He grit his teeth and said, "Just give me 2 jumbo books of 15 for each of us." He glared at the ticket attendant, paid the money, and walked with his family into the park. As he entered the supposed magical world, he turned to his wife, who was attentively listening to Sarah explain what she wanted to do that day. He loved his wife. She had been there for him when no one else believed in him. Even when he doubted himself, his wife had never wavered. He reached over and took her hand, and he allowed himself to smile as Sarah dragged them both into the park. But out of the blue, a short, thin, brown-haired man just walked straight into him. He could feel himself falling, but luckily he caught himself in time, merely stumbling backwards. His initial fear of falling turned to anger when he realized the man could have easily knocked over his daughter. "Hey, buddy, watch where you're going!" The man uttered an apology and walked away towards the nearby fire station. And as Barish watched the man walk away, he thought him rather odd. He had no wife or kids in tow, and he was wearing a suit in the searing heat. "Mary Poppins!" Rebecca took her daughter over to the square to watch Mary Poppins sing. Whatever that stupid song is. Barish knew his daughter had listened to it 1,000,000 times. But Sol remained curious about the man in the suit, who had just disappeared into the fire station. Barish looked closer, but he didn't see any rides or attractions in the station itself. No deliriously happy workers or Mickey Mouse characters. It only housed the standard fire wagon from decades past. Barish walked closer, and he saw a nondescript door. Barish looked back at his daughter, who remained entranced by Mary Poppins, and he approached the door. Sir, the fire station is for cast members only, but there's a great penny arcade just on the other side of the town square." Barish looked over and saw a man dressed in a ridiculous striped red vest with a yellow straw boater hat smiling at him. The employee seemed way too happy considering he was wearing a ridiculous outfit. He looked like a barber from the 1800s. Barish looked the employee up and down and went back to his wife and child in the town square. But throughout the song, Barish kept looking back at the fire station. His eyes wandered up to the second floor of the station, and he saw a figure staring back at him. At first, Barish thought it was the guy who bumped into him. But it wasn't. He was much older. It can't be. But it was. Barish blinked and squinted, so he knew his eyes weren't playing tricks on him. Walt Disney was looking right back at him. The Walt Disney. He was there, above the fire station, just standing there. Barish walked back toward the station, keeping his eyes fixed on Walt. As he got closer, he could make out Disney's expression. Far from the TV shows, Disney didn't look happy. He looked upset. Barish inched closer to the station, transfixed by Walt's gaze. "Daddy, I want to go see the jungle!" His daughter came up and began pulling at his hand. I think that's an e-ticket attraction." His wife pulled out the books of tickets from her purse, and Sarah continued to pull her father away from Disney's gaze. Barish picked his daughter up, but when he looked back to the fire station, Disney was gone. He looked at all the windows and doors of the fire station, but there was no sign of anyone. Not even that ridiculous barber. He turned away and walked down Main Street, USA with his family towards Cinderella's castle. And despite his child's elated utterances and questions, he tuned his daughter out and continued to ask himself, why would Walt Disney be distressed in the middle of a theme park that was making more money than a federal mint? If Walt Disney was distressed, then perhaps so was his company. Barish smelled an opportunity, and he vowed to look into the company's financials. But first, his daughter had to go meet Cinderella. And he hadn't forgotten about replacing her raggedy Mickey Mouse doll either. This has been Chapters 1 and 2 of Saving Walt, written by Andrew L. Young and performed by Owen McEwen. We hope you have enjoyed this broadcast.